Hey everyone, time for another video. Today I'm taking a look at the Pentium E5400, a fantastic overclocker on the 775 socket from Intel, which had its initial release back on the 18th of January 2009. The E5000 series of Pentiums were initially known as Pentium dual cores, with future Pentiums being released later on down the line known simply as Pentium. The E5000 series was essentially the exact same as the E7000 series of Core 2 Duo processors, just with 1MB of L2 cache disabled, but were pretty much the same otherwise. The E5400 we have here today originally launched at a price of $84, the same price as a slightly slower E5200 Pentium that launched around only 4 months earlier. Adjusting for inflation, that's around $100 today, or around £79 or €90, minus any other taxes. And to put that price into perspective, you can buy a quad-core AMD Ryzen 3 2200G in the UK for around that price as of the time of writing. And that actually has pretty decent built-in graphics, whereas the E5400 has none at all. I've had the E5400 waiting for review for quite a while, but back when I bought it, it was only 25 pence at CEX in the UK, which is still being sold for right now. That's fantastic for a processor with as much overclocking headroom as this has, which I'll get into later on. You can also pick it up for as little as $3 on eBay.com in America. Again, a bargain for such a great overclocker. That aside, let's have a run through of the specs of the E5400. As I mentioned, it was a dual-core processor but without hyperthreading or turbo boosting. Ran at a frequency of 2.7 GHz with an 800 MHz frontside bus speed, with a TDP of only 65 watts, making it easy enough to keep cool. It used the Wolfdale FreeM architecture, meaning it has 3MB of L2 cache but with 1MB disabled, giving 2MB of L2 cache in total, and featured 228 million transistors built on the 45nm fabrication process. As well as the 2MB of L2 cache, which was split between 2 cores, it also had 64KB of L1 cache per core as well. Memory-wise, it carried support for DDR1, 2 and 3, although you'll be hard-pressed to find many socket 775 motherboards supporting DDR1 nowadays. The rest of the system I'll be using today features a Gigabyte EP45-DS3L motherboard, 8GB of DDR2 RAM at 800 MHz, a MSI GTX 1080 Armor OC Edition graphics card to eliminate any bottlenecks other than the E5400 itself, Windows 7 Ultimate 64-bit, and a Phanteks TC14PE to keep the Pentium cool. I've also disabled all power saving settings in the BIOS, so let's get on with the tests. First up is Cinebench R20, the multi-threaded benchmark from Maxon, based on their Cinema 4D software, and is designed to use all of your processor's cores to render a photorealistic 3D image, giving you a score at the end of the test based on how long it took to complete. I ran the test a total of 3 times and averaged out the scores to give a reliable representation of what the E5400 can manage, and at the stock speed of 2.7 GHz, the E5400 managed scores for its 3 runs of 303, 301 and 301 points respectively, for an average score of 301.67 points, 11.28% slower than the 2.83 GHz Core 2 Duo E8300 I've tested before. Overclocking wise though, and here's where it gets good, as I managed a quite simply staggering stable overclock of 4.1 GHz, 51.85% higher than stock clocks. I used a voltage of 1.43 volts in the BIOS, which in reality was around 1.376 to 1.408 volts, the max you'd want to use for Wolfdale based processors for daily usage. I'll put the rest of the settings I used in the description below. And at this speed, the scores for the 3 tests shot up to 453, 451 and 456 points respectively, for an average score of 453.33 points, a 50.27% increase in score, and also 11.75% faster than the E8300 overclocked to around 3.8 GHz, the max it would manage at the time. Lastly, before getting on to the game tests, is the physics portion of the 3D Mark Firestrike benchmark, which was originally designed to be a showcase benchmark for DirectX 11 capable systems. Like Cinebench R20, I'll be running the test a total of 3 times and averaging out the scores to give a reliable representation of what the Pentium is capable of. And at the E5400 stock clock of 2.7 GHz, it managed runs of 2,245, 2,261 and 2,227 points respectively, for an average score of 2,244.33 points, 6.93% slower than the Core 2 Duo E8300. At the 4.1 GHz overclock though, the scores again shot up to 3,487, 3,408 and 3,452 points for the free test respectively, giving an average of 3,449 points, a 53.68% increase in score over stock clocks, which puts it at 18.16% faster than the overclocked E5300, and 9.34% faster than the newer Ivy Bridge-based Pentium G2120, which had a small overclock. To kick off the game tests for today is a personal favourite of mine, Warframe, which had its initial release back in 2013 and is available to download through Steam or from the Warframe website itself. I'm running the game at 1080p using the lowest settings possible with the field of view setting at its maximum, and I'm running the test in a survival mission on Jupiter, which I'd like to point out has had its starting location changed since I last benchmarked it, so results may vary to what I would have managed before. On the lander craft there was no noticeable stutter or locking up in either test, and FPS was in the mid-80s up to the mid-150 FPS range at stock clocks, with the overclock managing to get up to around 195 FPS and dropping no lower than the high 110 FPS range. Neither had any issues on the planet selection screen, although stock clocks did show FPS constantly below 60 here. Both had issues in Maru's Bazaar on Mars, with both tests showing noticeable stutter and lockups going into the area, and there was also noticeable micro stuttering here in both tests. During the mission itself though, there was some noticeable micro stutter at points at stock clocks, especially in intense scenes with lots of enemies around you, with some being noticed in the overclocked test as well, although you'll likely not notice them that often anyway. FPS wise, stock clocks managed to hit around the mid-90s and dipped as low as 31 FPS depending on the amount of action around you and your location on the map. It was when these dips happened that the micro stutter was quite noticeable. The overclock though showed gameplay to be noticeably smoother than its stock, and managed to get up to around 105 to 112 FPS depending on your location on the map and the level of action going on around you, and I never saw it dip below 50 FPS at all throughout the test. Overall, the overclock showed a massive improvement over stock clocks, which managed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 43, 25 and 20 FPS respectively, with multiple dips under 30 FPS according to the frame time graph, and spikes in frame times throughout of up to around 40 milliseconds, some reaching nearly 80 milliseconds, and one spike of 260 milliseconds. The overclock managed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 65, 40 and 34 FPS respectively, and there was only one spike in frame times of 40 milliseconds. There were some dips below 30 FPS throughout, although you won't notice them happening. Next up is CSGO, or Counter-Strike Global Offensive, a first-person shooter released back in 2012, but one that still enjoys massive popularity and has a huge professional scene as well. I'll also be running this at 1080p using the lowest settings possible, and I'm running this test on the hard difficulty competitive bot match on the Mirage map, so performance online may vary from what you see here. Performance at stock clocks wasn't particularly great, but was mostly playable. It had quite noticeable micro stuttering when turning the camera, which could be quite jarring depending on your tolerance for it. There were also dips just under 30 FPS at times, and highs in the low 70s, depending on your location on the map and the level of action going on around you. Thankfully, combat didn't seem to be affected by the issues though. The overclock on the other hand reduced these issues massively. There was still some noticeable stutter at points, but it was far less than what stock clocks showed. FPS in this test hit nearly 120 FPS and only dipped as low as the mid-40s. Again, this is dependent on your location on the map and the level of action going on around you. Despite the massively reduced stutter compared to stock clocks, the dips to the mid-40s were quite noticeable though. Neither test showed any problems with input lag or locking, and overall, the overclock made the game far more playable and enjoyable compared to stock clocks. Average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates for stock clocks were 49, 26 and 18 FPS respectively, and there were multiple frame time spikes throughout the test of around 40 to 100 milliseconds, with some more of around 140 to 220 milliseconds, which you would have seen represented as a stutter throughout. The overclock fared far better though, with figures of 72, 41 and 31 FPS for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively. It did however have multiple frame time spikes throughout of up to 120 milliseconds. Moving on to GTA 5, and at stock clocks the game is pretty uncomfortable to play, less so with the overclock, although that still had its issues. I'm running the game at 1080p on the lowest settings possible using the DirectX 11 mode, and at stock, FPS throughout the city only got as high as the high 20s, but dropped as low as 11 at times, with some pretty severe stuttering throughout. There was also one brief lockup here as well. The overclock still showed some pretty noticeable stutter throughout the city as well, although the FPS here was far better, with lows in the low 30s and highs in the high 40s, but that couldn't make up for the stuttering. The overclock test showed no issues with input lag or locking at all, although stock clocks did show issues with minor input lag and locking at points, which would make driving a bit difficult, although by no means impossible. I also noticed a brief lockup on the highway heading into the desert area of the game, and there were some brief lockups throughout the test with the overclock as well. Stock clocks showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 24, 11 and 8 FPS respectively, with spikes in frame times throughout of up to around 155 milliseconds, a couple of around 200 milliseconds, and one lasting 500 milliseconds, showing just how bad the stutter is at times. The overclock showed a reasonable improvement in the benchmark, although it certainly wasn't as much of a difference as the other games showed. It managed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 32, 17 and 12 FPS respectively, and had a lot of spikes in frame times throughout the test of up to 100 milliseconds, some more of around 120 to just over 200 milliseconds, and a couple of 400 and 600 milliseconds respectively. Last up for the test today is Rise of the Tomb Raider, a game which I still haven't finished, and which is the reason I'm not testing Shadow of the Tomb Raider instead, to avoid any spoilers. That and a lack of money to actually buy it. That aside, I'm running this at 1080p on the low settings preset using the DirectX 11 mode, as Microsoft are only supporting DirectX 12 on Windows 7 with select titles. Rise of the Tomb Raider isn't a real DirectX 12 game anyway, so would most likely perform worse. Both tests showed the game to be pretty uncomfortable to play at times, although it was far worse and completely unplayable at stock clocks. With the overclocks though, despite its issues, I'd say it was in fact playable overall, it just wasn't always playable in the sense of being enjoyable. At the start of the test, stock clocks had the FPS no higher than 30, with FPS dipping below 15. There was a significant amount of stutter, which had a noticeable effect on combat. The overclock though pushed these figures as high as nearly 50 FPS, with dips to around the low 20s. Combat seemed far easier as well, although there was one occasion at the start of the test in which there was noticeable stuttering, and at the worst, the game dipped as low as 13 FPS, and stuttered pretty badly when it happened. An issue I noticed with the overclock that I didn't notice at stock clocks was that on a couple of occasions the animations took a bit longer to start than normal. At stock clocks throughout the Soviet installation, there was a significant amount of stuttering at times, which was especially noticeable when turning the camera, with the same being true for performance in the copper mill area as well. The overclock fared far better in these areas, although it couldn't fix the issues totally, as the stuttering was still noticeable, with the same being true for the copper mill, which at times was still actually quite jarring to play through. Both tests also had issues with texture popping happening at the Wolf Den in the Soviet installation as well. Overall, the overclock was far smoother than stock clocks, but is still uncomfortable to play at times. Stock clocks showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 28, 8 and 5 FPS respectively, with spikes in frame times throughout the test of around 100 to 295 milliseconds, with a couple more at around 410 to 440 milliseconds at the worst, showing just how bad performance is. The overclock showed 37, 14 and 9 FPS for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, and had multiple spikes in frame times throughout the test of up to around 160 milliseconds, a couple of around 175 to 205 milliseconds, and some more of around 240 to 300 milliseconds. The frame times in the latter half of the test were also very inconsistent, showing that there was a lot of stutter in the second half of the test. Overall, I quite enjoyed testing the E5400, mainly because of just how good its overclocking capabilities are. 4.1 GHz is nearly a 52% overclock over what it runs at stock. To put that into perspective, an equivalent overclock, percentage-wise at least, on the i7 6700K in my personal system would put it at nearly 6.4 GHz, which simply isn't possible without exotic cooling such as liquid nitrogen. That aside though, the overclock has shown that games such as Warframe and CSGO are entirely playable and enjoyable, whereas more intensive games such as GTA 5 or Rise of the Tomb Raider are just too much for it. To be fair though, as long as you're not expecting smooth 60 FPS plus performance and are okay with the issues, it is entirely possible to still play those games as long as you overclock. It just isn't going to be the most comfortable of experiences. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a comment and a like, and subscribing to my channel if you'd like to see more content like this, and maybe even sharing the video with people you think may enjoy it. And although there's no obligation to do so, you can support me in creating these videos through my Patreon at patreon.com/Benching&Gaming, or through Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/Benching&Gaming. So thanks again for watching. It means a lot that you would take the time to watch my content. Hopefully I'll see you in the next one.